It was almost 6 o'clock in the evening when Patrick Dunn finally got home Wednesday night. He had worked an extra hour and a half to finish the wiring job that Wayne Falk, his supervisor, had assigned him that morning. Because he stayed late, he was able to complete the job almost a half day earlier than the estimate. That said, he had worked like a damn man all day, and you could feel it in his sore muscles. It was almost a good thing that his wife Glenda had left that morning for 3 days of seminars in Columbus. He had originally offered to take the day off and accompany her on the trip, but she had kept him on his toes by reminding him that the two of them would be taking a cruise during spring break. They had tickets, and he had already booked a vacation for the trip. The tickets were displayed prominently on the middle shelf of the china cabinet so that they could be seen by looking into the dining room. Patrick was a little surprised that there was no message on the answering machine saying that she had arrived all right. She had decided to make the 3-hour trip rather than take one of the commuter planes, which wouldn't have been unreasonable either. If he remembered correctly, check-in started at 7 p.m., so he decided to give her a quick call and hit the speed dial button on their wall phone that connected him to her cell phone. It only rang twice before she answered. "I was just about to call you, Patrick. You must have read my mind." Her voice was happy, and he could hear the crowd buzzing around her. He wasn't surprised that she knew he was on the phone, because the display showed that the incoming call was from her home phone. "You know I've always been able to read your mind, darling. So you've obviously gotten there safely. How's the traffic situation? I hope you still have fenders on your car?" He chuckled loudly, knowing her first response would be to defend her driving skills. He imagined the look of annoyance on her pretty face and realized that if they were face to face, she would stick her tongue out to let him know what she thought of his question. The fact that it was early January and there might be a little snowfall worried him a little. If she'd gone by car, he'd be happy if she'd gone by plane. He was relieved that she had answered so quickly. She laughed and replied, "Of course, everything is safe and sound. The trip here went without incident. Traffic was light and I found the Sheraton Hotel with no problem. That map you printed off the internet was very helpful, dear. You know I'll do anything to help you, dear. Nothing is too good for my Glenda, as I always say. I spoke to my boss this morning and he happily agreed to give me the day off so I could join you." "No, you're not coming here," she replied quickly, her voice going an octave higher. After hesitating for a few seconds, she continued more calmly. "We've talked about this before, Patrick. You know I want to wait until spring break so we can go on a trip together." "Yeah, I know. I'm just pulling your chain, Glenda. I haven't talked to them about any time off." That was what he was going to answer, even before she flatly rejected the idea, but it bothered him that she was so firm in her response. "I'll stay home like a good boy and do as I'm told." He laughed, as it was not in his nature to let her get her way so easily. He noticed the relief in her voice when she said, "Glad to hear it, Patrick. It's just going to be a boring few days, and I've already picked out a full schedule of seminars to attend. While we're here, we wouldn't have time to do anything together. You said I must be reading your mind, Glenda. Did you want to talk to me about something?" "Oh, I'm glad you reminded me. I can't find my traveling bag. You know, the one with the sewing kit, lint remover, and other things in it. I was sure I packed it. Could you check in the bedroom to see if I left it there? Maybe it's in the trunk of the car if you don't see it there." "Sure, babe." "Wait a minute. I'll pick up the cordless phone in the bedroom." He put the receiver on the counter and quickly headed upstairs to their bedroom. He had only had time to take 2 steps into the room when he saw the briefcase she was looking for on the corner of the dresser. He picked up the cordless phone and said, "Problem solved. The bag you were looking for is right here on the tall dresser. Just have to be careful not to lose any buttons and stay away from the lint." He laughed. "Oh, thank goodness it's there. I didn't want to have to go down to the garage to look for it. They have a little store near the lobby and I can just buy whatever I need." She hesitated for a few seconds before continuing. "I have to go now, dear. They opened the registration desk early and I'm already third in line." She quickly continued. "I probably won't be calling much this week because tomorrow night I have an evening presentation from 7:30 to 10 p.m., and they have a fancy dinner planned for Friday night. Saturday morning is my last seminar, so I'll head home right after lunch and have time to have dinner with you, honey." "That's all right, dear. I worked extra today, and I'll probably be able to make it Thursday and Friday. Call me if you can, and I'll call you if anything important comes up. Anyway, I'll see you at dinner on Saturday. They exchanged a few more pleasantries before ending the conversation. As Patrick went downstairs to hang up, he began to think about Glenda and her reaction to his joke about wanting to join her. For months now, she had been acting a little strange, either too quiet or too eager to please. Even when they had first seriously discussed the possibility of him accompanying her on this trip, her reaction had been an emphatic rejection of the idea. The realization that he was hungry distracted him from thinking about Glenda's recent actions, and he decided to order a pizza. There was still almost 40 minutes until the estimated delivery time, so he headed straight upstairs to remove his dirty work uniform and take a shower. After that, he changed into jeans and one of his many work shirts emblazoned with the logo of Anderson Electric, his employer. He was relaxing at the kitchen table, sipping a beer, when they brought him a pizza. He knew he should have made himself a better dinner, but being overweight had never been a problem for him. His job kept him in great shape. Glenda wasn't a big fan of pizza, so he felt comfortable indulging himself while she was away. The next day, he would pack leftovers for lunch. Most of the workstations had a microwave where he could heat up the food. He spent the next hour watching one of the news programs on TV, but soon realized that his concentration on the talking head had waned, and he was back to thinking about Glenda and her change in behavior over the past 60-plus days. It bothered him that something had changed with her, and that she had objected so strongly to him joining her on her big trip. Glenda was a real beauty in her 35 years, tall and slender, with long dark hair and dark eyes. She worked as a sociology professor at a local college. She had just been hired as a professor at the end of the previous academic year and was very proud of the fact that she had succeeded. As one of the junior faculty members, she had more classes than the others, but she mentioned that she was given the services of a teaching assistant, or TA as she called it. When the fall semester started, she told him how nice it was that her TA, a senior who was graduating in the spring, could do some of the grading and student advising tasks that she had always been solely responsible for. She mentioned that his name was Anthony, but Patrick couldn't remember if he'd ever heard his last name. His name had come up a few times in the first couple months, but she hadn't said anything about him in a while. In mid-November, she started talking about some upcoming seminars she wanted to attend. They were scheduled for the week off between New Year's Eve and the start of the second semester. It was considered professional development, and the college was paying most of the cost. At first, when he had suggested she go with him, she had raised no objections. However, after 2 weeks, she decided she didn't want him to go with her and suggested a trip during spring break instead. Reluctantly, he agreed to her emphatic decision. There was little talk of seminars at Christmas, and they enjoyed the holiday, spending it with family and friends. He noticed that she had received several large envelopes with registration and training materials, and that her registration had been quickly sent back. She seemed eager to travel, and had even started packing her suitcase a couple days before New Year's Eve. She had always been organized, and this was not unusual for her. He returned to their bedroom just after 8 o'clock, intending to continue reading the book he had left unread on the bedside table. When he got to the bedroom and noticed the bag Glenda had mentioned, he decided to put it back on the closet shelf where it was usually kept. When he picked it up, he noticed that it was on top of Glenda's journal, a book he thought she usually kept in her bag. They had been married for 8 years, but he rarely saw her diary, as she hid it in a safe place most of the time. He had jokingly asked her to let him read the diary years ago, right after they were married, but she had flatly refused, letting him know that it was her personal and private use. She said it was the same as her thoughts or memory and for her eyes only. They never discussed the subject again, and in the 8 years of their marriage, he had only seen it in her hands a couple of times. Both times it had caught her by surprise, and as soon as she saw it, she closed the book and snapped the little lock, effectively locking it away. Patrick suspected that she did her journal entries while in her office at the college, though she could have done it at home while he was at work. Their schedules didn't match, and she was usually home when he left and back by the time he finished his shift. Returning the bag to the closet, he walked back to the dresser and picked up the journal, the first time he'd touched it in a while. The book was 6 inches by 8 inches and an inch thick. It was bound in red leather and closed securely with a latch held by a small brass lock. As he picked up the book, it occurred to Patrick that it probably held the secret to Glenda's change in behavior over the past few months. Instead of putting the book back on the dresser, he carried it downstairs, returning to the kitchen. The light was much brighter there, and he scrutinized the book and its lock. The first thing he noticed was that when he examined the top and bottom of the book, it appeared that only a third of the pages showed signs of use, and the rest looked untouched. His first thought was that there was no way this book could be Glenda's only diary. It was unlikely that 8 years' worth of entries could only take up a third of the book. He knew there must be other, older volumes. After pondering for a few minutes, Patrick realized that the only likely place the earlier diaries could have been kept was Glenda's closet. They each had their own closet, and he had never gone into hers. Pondering this, he headed up the stairs to their bedroom. After 5 minutes of careful searching, he found a shoebox on the back top shelf, and upon opening it, he discovered a stack of red leather diaries. He immediately returned to the kitchen with his treasure. The first thing he noticed was that all the diaries were the same. Each had a small round white sticker on the spine, and the 6 books he found were numbered 1 through 6. The one currently in use was unnumbered. Looking closer, he realized that each of them had the name Coombs embossed on the bottom of the back cover, and he recognized it as the name of a local specialty store. The next thing he noticed was that all 7 locks were identical. None of them had any identifying numbers or marks on them. He wondered if they were all locked with the same key. Another thought came quickly to mind, and he immediately turned to the shelf under the phone and grabbed the phone book. In just a few seconds, he found the phone number for Coombs Specialties. It was now 25 minutes to 9, and he wondered if they would be open since many downtown stores were open late on Wednesday nights. After 2 rings, the phone was picked up. Coombs Specialties. How may I help you? The voice belonged to a young woman, and her question sounded sincere. Hello. I understand you sell red leather dailies measuring approximately 6 by 8 inches. Do you know if you have any of those in stock right now? I'd like to get one as a gift. I think I know what book you're talking about. Just hold on and I'll go see if they're on the shelf. She wasn't on the phone for about 3 minutes, and when she returned, she said, Yes, we have 2 in stock. After making sure the store would be open until 10 p.m., Patrick quickly left to look at one of the new diaries, which could possibly be used as a source to get the little key that opened them. The chances were slim, but he knew that if he tried to open one of the locks, he would probably ruin it, and Glenda would probably never let him forget that he had tried to look in her diaries. Within half an hour, Patrick was on his way home again, and in his bag he had one of the red leather diaries with a key. It wasn't cheap, almost $60, but he didn't care about the price. It was a small price to pay for him to be able to find out what was bothering his wife. He could always use the new diary as her birthday present. He already had visions of her hiding her illness from him. She'd done it once before when the results of the pap test turned out to be abnormal, and she'd bottled up her worries instead of sharing them with him. It didn't end up being a big deal, but he couldn't help but know that she had a mammogram in the fall. Another thing he thought might have caused her concern was the infighting that was going on among the college faculty. He knew that if she had a problem with a coworker, she would never tell him about it. Glenda believed that she should handle her own problems and make her own decisions when it came to her job. Of course, there was another possibility. He made a conscious effort to ignore her, but she kept prying into his thoughts. What if she was having an affair? Like any gullible husband, he couldn't bring himself to admit the thought, and instead focused on other possible explanations. In some ways, they were an unlikely pair. He was an inch shorter than her, with blonde, neatly trimmed hair and blue eyes. He was muscular and she was tall and slender. They had known each other since high school and had even dated a couple times. After high school, they had gone their separate ways, with Patrick becoming an apprentice electrician and Glenda going to college and graduate school. They met by chance in their final year of college when they were both invited to a mutual friend's birthday party. They hit it off immediately and married a month after she graduated. By then, he was already working as a master electrician and had a small house for which he had recently made a down payment. That house had been their home for the first 5 years, but with Glenda now earning a good salary and Patrick working full-time, they decided to move to a larger house. They had already discussed having a baby, or maybe 2, and decided that by the end of the school year, Glenda would stop using the birth control pills she had been taking throughout their marriage. Back home, Patrick wasn't 100% sure that the key to the new journal he'd bought would fit the locks of the journals he'd found. The key, kept in a small brown envelope in the box that held the diary, seemed very small to him. He began to think that perhaps he should have just asked the salesman if all the locks had the same key. He had already decided that if the key didn't fit, he would forget the whole endeavor. If each lock was locked with a different key, He wasn't going to waste time searching the house for Glenda's hidden stash of diary keys. Anyway, 5 minutes after he walked through the door, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of diaries and an open can of Coke in front of him. The small key was in his right hand, and he was looking at the 7th diary, the one with Glenda's last entries. He knew that if he tried to use that key and it worked, there would be no turning back. He would open her diary and read what she had made clear was meant to be left for her alone. He sat like that for a few minutes, trying to decide if he wanted to cross that line. He worried that somehow he'd accidentally let her know he'd been peeking, and she'd never trust him again. Eventually, concern for her health and the constant unspoken question in the back of his mind prompted him to pick the lock. The key fit precisely, turned smoothly, and the lock opened with a click. In a few seconds, the book was in his possession, and he opened it to the last page Glenda had used. At the top of the page was the date of the previous day, and about 3/4 of the page had been used. He quickly began to read the neat handwriting written on the page. It took about a minute to read the lines, and by the time he had finished, his face had turned pale, lost all expression, and his eyes had taken on that glint that tears create. He slowly stood up, picked up the can of Coke, and walked over to the kitchen sink. Standing there and staring blankly out the kitchen window, he slowly squeezed the can of Coke, not noticing that the drink soon began to overflow the open can and run down his arm into the sink. Eventually, he did notice his wet and sticky hand, dropped the crushed can into the sink, and washed his fingers clean of the grime. Wiping his hands with a paper towel, he picked up the stack of diaries along with his key and slowly made his way to the living room. He placed the stack of books on the end table next to the recliner, turned on the lamp hanging above it, and sat down in his favorite chair. As he made himself comfortable, he picked up the unnumbered 7th journal and opened it to the first page. He had a very clear idea of how the story would end. Now he needed to know how it had begun. The page he had read had forever changed his view of his perfect wife and their perfect life together. He needed to find out the details of how it happened, and he hoped the diary would help him do that. Instead of reading the events in reverse order, he chose to read them chronologically. For a while, he thought about going straight to the Sheraton Hotel, going up to room 412 and dealing with his wife. But he quickly decided that would probably be a surefire losing proposition. Either he'd get into a traffic accident rushing there, or he wouldn't be able to hold his own if he got there in one piece. The only option would have been to call her, but he was afraid he'd break down hearing her voice, and he was too much of a man to break down like that. The first page was dated early June, just over 6 months ago. He began reading it, carefully searching for anything that might have anything to do with the devastating information Glenda had written on the last page. None of the entries pertaining to the summer months contained anything that could help him understand his wife and the plans she was making. There were a few mentions of being content with her life, her husband, and how her career had progressed since she'd been hired. Everything he read should have made him feel happy and proud and confident in his marriage, but he knew how the story would end when he reached the last page. That knowledge spoiled all the good things he was reading. In early September, Glenda finally made an entry in her diary that had something to do with what Patrick was looking for. He leaned back in his chair and reread the relevant part of the entry twice. The 8th of September. Dear Diary, my new assistant dropped by my office today. He is a little taller than me, maybe an inch or so, has black hair, dark eyes, and a short beard, rather unshaven. He introduced himself as Anthony Romano, and he reminds me of someone, maybe a movie star. He left me a printout of his grades, and he seems to have good qualifications. Patrick began reading the diary more carefully, looking for any other mention of Anthony Romano, the teaching assistant. There was nothing in the next 2 entries, which contained only thoughts about her classes and how they were going. She seemed to be quite content, although perhaps a little nervous about how she would handle one of the larger classes she had. It had over 100 students, and she wondered how she would handle that many. The 15th of September. Dear Diary, Anthony is now helping me with my large class. He answers students' questions when I am busy preparing materials for lecture. I have noticed that my female students seem to be partial to him. I heard 2 of them discussing him as they left the classroom and mentioned that he looked a lot like Leonardo DiCaprio. That must be why he seemed familiar to me. As he continued to read, the mentions of Anthony Romano became more and more frequent. He read even more carefully now, pausing at times to reread certain passages. The 20th of September. Classes are going on as usual. A few students have dropped out. I think they thought the course was too difficult for them. I have noticed that when I lecture, Anthony takes a seat in one of the front rows, where he seems to spend all his time watching me. I'll have to give him more work. The 24th of September. I had about 3 free hours this afternoon and was working on a reading assignment when Anthony dropped by my office. He stayed to help, and the work went quickly. We both made copies and selected articles for inclusion. The entry continued with a long paragraph in which she mentioned her intention to talk to Patrick about how children might fit into their future. It was the first entry he found that mentioned the topic. The 30th of September. During the lecture, I caught Anthony looking at me again. I looked at him and frowned, and I'm sure he realized what I meant, but he just grinned and continued to watch me. At the end of every class, at least a couple female students approach him to ask him questions about the lecture. None of them seem to want to approach me for information. My guess is that they are more interested in him than they are in helping him. Overall, my students seem to be doing well, which makes me very happy. It's not that I haven't lectured before, but now that I'm a full professor, I feel more pressure for my students to succeed. Several recordings in a row did not mention Anthony, although it was obvious from them that her classes were going very well. In all the recordings, she was happy and upbeat and mentioned her firm decision to talk to Patrick about their plans. He remembered that it had been sometime in the fall when they had first talked at length about their shared desire to have at least one child. Glenda wanted to finish her first year as a full professor without the worries and responsibilities of pregnancy, so they decided to wait until the end of the school year and start trying to conceive. October 8. I am so excited! Patrick and I have decided to have kids, and I plan to stop taking the pill as soon as the spring semester is over. I told Anthony about all of this, and he seemed so happy for us. We were in my office, and he walked over to where I was sitting at my desk, took my hand and lifted me to my feet, and then hugged me very tightly. He took me by surprise, and when he seemed reluctant to let me go, I had to gently push him away and remind him that my office door was open and anyone could walk by. The 10th of October. Anthony came into my office this afternoon, and I must confess to being a little concerned. I did not see him come in, and only realized he was there when I heard the door close and lock. When I looked up at him, he smiled at me and said, "Now no one can pass by and see us." I clearly told him to open the door, and he did. He stayed for about 15 minutes and then finally left. Now I wonder what he meant to say when he locked the door. The 11th of October. I was preparing questions for a test paper for my freshman year when Anthony came over to see me today. He stayed to help, and it really made the work easier. He apologized for closing the door yesterday, and I told him it was okay. When I asked why he was so interested in me, he said that he enjoyed the company of mature women much more than girls his age. I told him that I was happily married, but I must admit that I found his words very flattering. The thought that he could potentially be more interested in me than some of the younger women at our college excites me so much that I find it amazing. The 13th of October. I expected Anthony to stop by my office today, but he didn't. I was a little disappointed as I wanted to talk to him some more about what he said about being interested in mature women. The 15th of October. There were a lot of students in my office today when Anthony came in. I was hoping he would stick around until the last one left, but he was gone when I finished discussing essay topics with the last group. The 16th of October. Today I finally got a chance to talk to Anthony. He asked if I could close the door so we wouldn't be disturbed, and I agreed. I was able to ask him about why he finds mature women more interesting, and he told me that his first experience was with a 40-year-old widow who lived in his neighborhood. He claims that girls his age don't know what they want themselves, not like mature women. I wanted to show him that I wasn't mad at him. He turned and walked out of my office without saying anything. I realize now that I should have condemned what he did and told him again that I was a happily married woman. But I didn't, and now every time I let my mind wander, I relive that moment. Patrick was disturbed by this entry because it showed him that while Anthony was constantly overreacting, Glenda was not reacting the way he thought she should. He left the book open on the chair and went to get a new can of Coke. Soon, he was back in the chair with the book in his hands, ready to continue reading about the apparent seduction of his wife. The 20th of October. Late this afternoon, just before I was about to leave the office to go home, Anthony appeared at the door and asked if I was busy. As soon as I replied that I wasn't, he walked in and closed the door behind him. He completely ignored my request to open the door and headed straight for me. He took my hands in his and told me that he had been thinking about me constantly for the past 4 days. He said he wanted another kiss, a longer one. I told him that I was not a widow looking for a lover and that it was not appropriate for him to pursue me in this way. He said he understood, but asked me again, saying it would be in honor of his birthday. I thought it would be the easiest way to get rid of him and agreed, which I now regret. I didn't know what to say and apologized for not having a birthday card to give him. He smiled and said it was okay. His birthday was in July. I should have been angry at him for tricking me, but I could only laugh at his ploy to get me to kiss him. He thanked me for the wonderful kiss and walked out of the office. I don't know what's wrong with him, but I'm afraid he might get to me. I will have to be more careful with him in the future. Anthony was not mentioned in the next 3 entries. Glenda was busy correcting a small test she had given to her largest class and checking the essays her students had sent in. Patrick thought it odd that Anthony didn't participate in these 2 assignments, but there was no hint in the journal entries as to why he didn't. The 30th of October. For the first time, I am at a loss how to tell you about my life. Probably the only thing I can do is to describe what happened today. I don't know how I'm going to handle Patrick when he gets home, as I'm afraid he might look at me and realize what happened. It all started when Anthony walked into my office this afternoon. I was busy reading and didn't hear him come in, and he surprised me with his cheery, "Hi." When I looked up, he was already closing and locking my office door. Somehow I didn't say a word to him about it. As he approached my desk, he reached over and took my shoulders and pulled me to him. He didn't let me say a word. I felt so ashamed. There's no excuse for not putting an end to it the moment it started, but it was like he turned on a switch in me. As soon as I realized what he was doing, I pushed him away. All he did was smile and say, "Don't even try to suggest that you didn't like it." I didn't say anything back, and he said, "I knew it." When I finally regained the power of speech, I asked him to leave. He smiled slyly and said I'd see you tomorrow. I realize that I'm not handling the situation with Anthony properly. He's making my life so difficult, and I'm sure he knows it. Maybe I should talk to Patrick about it, but I know he won't be too happy with the way I've let things develop. Worst of all, I think about Anthony from time to time. The entire entry for the day consisted of a description of how Anthony felt about his wife, and as he reread it for the 3rd time, Patrick realized that he was once again angry enough to lose control of himself if Anthony were in front of him. Until that moment, he had never considered himself capable of extreme cruelty. The 2nd of November. I think I finally stopped worrying about how I would behave in Patrick's presence. That first night was the hardest. Every time I talked to Patrick or he looked at me, I was sure he would guess what had happened in my office. At one point, he asked if something was bothering me, as I was apparently acting a little abnormal under pressure. He accepted my denial without question, and I thought about how easy it was for me to keep things from my husband. I hope I never have to do that again. The 6th of November. It's been a few days since I last saw Anthony alone. He was in a class where he is contractually obligated to help me, and I noticed that he is still looking at me. When he catches my gaze, he smirks, and I know I blushed the first couple times it happened. I find myself wondering how I'll act the next time he shows up in my office alone. The 8th of November. Anthony came into my office this afternoon, but there were several other students already there. I happened to look up as he turned to leave, and he kissed me and then smirked. I'm sure the other students didn't notice it since they were standing with their backs to him, but I wish he had been more attentive to my position. Just after the New Year, I received an invitation to attend a seminar series in Columbus. It looks interesting, and I think I'll attend if I can. I ordered an information packet. The 9th of November. Yesterday was another day that will be very difficult to write about. I am again very unhappy with Anthony's behavior and my own, and I wonder how it will all end if I don't do something about it soon. I had a couple of hours to spare this morning and was hard at work when I heard the office door close and lock. I don't know how Anthony manages to sneak in without me knowing. I asked him to open it, but he just ignored me. When he tried to lift me from my seat, I resisted. Unfortunately, my resistance waned as he continued. I thought, what harm can one more little kiss do? If only that was all there was to it. As soon as I regained control of myself, I pushed him away and ran to the bathroom. Tears stood in my eyes as I got my clothes back to normal. All I could think about was how angry Patrick would be if he saw us, or if he ever found out about this. Anthony walked through the bathroom door. He must have seen that I was really upset and left as soon as he said he wasn't going to apologize and hoped we could do it again. I should have told him not to even think about it, but I was upset and only regained my composure after he left. What surprised me the most was how well I handled myself in Patrick's presence when he got home from work. I'm sure he didn't suspect a thing, and I could hardly believe that I didn't feel tense as we talked throughout the evening. The entire day's entry was again devoted to the Anthony episode, and Patrick reread it several times as his anger built up again. Finally, he turned the page and continued reading Glenda's diary. For a whole week, there was not a single mention of Anthony or anything to do with the developing relationship between Glenda and her TA. Moreover, Patrick noticed a certain sense of satisfaction in her entries. The 17th of November. God, I just don't know what's happening to me. Anthony has taken hold of me in ways I never imagined. I don't know if it's his rough exterior or some flaw in me, but I just can't hold my own around him. This afternoon, he came into my office and sat on the corner of my desk. I told him we would have to talk about what happened the last time he was here, and he quickly agreed. He just watched me and smiled as I told him how wrong it was that we were somehow connected. I reminded him that I was happily married and that my position as a professor could be jeopardized if anyone found out what we had done. As I spoke, he only nodded and smiled at me. When I finished speaking, I leaned back in my chair, confident that he understood my position. Despite my reasonable approach and confidence that the situation was resolved, I detected strange behavior from him. After a few minutes, which seemed like several minutes but actually lasted only seconds and 40, he asked me if I wanted to lock the door or if he should do it. I couldn't find my voice, and after waiting only a few seconds, he got up, closed, and locked the door to my office. Walking back to my desk, he invited me to join him on the small leather couch in front of the bookcase. I can't find the words to explain why I agreed to his request. An hour later, he thanked me and left. We've entered dangerous territory, and I just don't know what to do about it. A big part of me wants to terminate his employment as my assistant, but another part of me says we didn't do anything that bad. I can never tell Patrick about this, and thankfully there's no chance he'll ever find out. My office is on the 4th floor, not facing the street so no one can see us. Hopefully my emotions will be back to normal before I go home to Patrick. Patrick had a hard time reading this post as it was obvious that the situation had escalated quickly. He already felt that he definitely didn't know his wife as well as he thought he did, and had already decided to read all of her diaries, no matter how long it took. He went back and reread 2 pages again. When he finished, he looked up and casually noticed that it was already 2 in the morning. He knew there were many more pages to go, but there was no way he could put the book aside. Before he started reading again, he called the Anderson Electric office and left a message on the answering machine saying that he would be free the next day for personal reasons. He had not yet made a final decision on what he would do, but he knew that his life had already changed forever. Where there had once been love and dreams of the future, there was now only cold emptiness and growing anger. He went into the bathroom to drink the last can of Coke before continuing to work on his journal, and then went back into the living room to get a new one. He wasn't tired and didn't think the caffeine in the soft drink was keeping him awake. His brain was working on a fast track, trying to digest everything he had read. He looked at his watch again and marveled that it was only 8 hours ago that he had talked to Glenda and had his suspicions. The 22nd of November. Anthony was in the office this afternoon, and I did my best to keep a desk between us. He didn't push his way in or try to lock the door. I had felt so guilty the last few days that I would never have agreed to let him even touch me. I think he sensed my determination to keep things on the right level between us. I hope I can keep that determination. For the next few days, there was no mention of Anthony in the records. He could tell that Glenda was in high spirits as the first semester was winding down. There were only a couple weeks left, and she was looking forward to the end of them. The 23rd of November. I told Patrick about the seminars, and he doesn't mind my participation. He even offered to take some time off to go with me. I'll have to think about it. We could do some things when I'm not attending seminars. It was obvious to Patrick that between the 23rd of November and mid-December, Glenda's decision to have him accompany her to the seminars had completely changed. He continued reading. The 25th of November. Anthony was in the office this afternoon asking if he could come over to my house. I clearly answered him that this was not going to happen. He was particularly interested to know if Patrick was working out of town at night. His next idea was to visit him at the house on 2nd Avenue that he shared with 3 other students. When I told him there was no way I was going to do that, he replied that I could always call him if I changed my mind. His name and number were in the phone book. Except for trying to convince me to meet him outside of college, he was on his usual behavior. I told him about the seminars I planned to attend, and he seemed quite interested in them. I told him they were for faculty only, but he only smiled. The 30th of November. Yesterday was another day that will be very difficult for me to tell you about. It seems to me that I have lost my way altogether. Last night I hardly slept at all, and even Patrick seemed to realize that something was wrong. I wish I could explain to him what's on my mind, but it's just not possible. I've dreamt about Anthony several times in the last couple days. I have no affection for him, but I just can't get over him and the things we did together. What is wrong with me that I can't stop him from doing this? I just stood there and watched him close and lock the door. I couldn't even imagine saying no to him. The whole time we were on the couch, my mind was telling me to stop. When he left, I closed the door and started to get dressed, crying. How could I let this happen? I spent the rest of the day at my desk with the door locked, alternately crying and thinking, trying to figure out how this happened. Maybe I should see a therapist. Although Patrick could see that there was genuine regret and anguish in Glenda's words, he could find no justification as to why it had happened, an act in which she had obviously participated willingly. The more he read, the darker his heart became, and the words he read had an extremely negative effect on his usually generous and happy personality. In the Patrick who appeared none of his friends, relatives, or even Glenda would recognize him. The 3rd of December. Anthony stopped me in the hall this morning and asked me if I would reconsider meeting him at the house he was sharing. He said he wanted to spend a few hours with me in a real bed. I told him to forget it, that I would never consider meeting him, especially in a place where I could be seen. I reminded him again about my husband and career. When he seemed resigned to my words, he quietly made another suggestion to me. He asked if he could accompany me to the seminars in January. He had seen my brochure from the Sheraton Hotel where the group was staying and said that for a group of sociology professors, all seats would be taken. He said he was willing to pay for his own room if I agreed to spend nights with him. I told him to forget it. Before he left, he smiled at me and told me I should think about it. I didn't say anything back to him, but the thought was already lodged in my head. What is wrong with me? Patrick had to take a break as the anger he felt at the two of them began to boil over. He paced back and forth across the living room a few times before heading to the kitchen for another can of Coke. He was tempted to have a few beers, but decided to keep a clear head. He was at a point where he already knew what he wanted to do, but he didn't have a plan, and he knew he would have to make a proper plan. He went back to the living room and opened his journal. The 7th of December. Anthony stopped by my office this morning for a moment to say goodbye. He is going to fly home for Christmas after his exam tomorrow. He wanted to know if he should come back early to go to the seminar with me. He said he knew I was considering that possibility. To distract him, I told him to call me in a few days, that I hadn't made a decision yet. He smiled and said he would call me in a couple days at my office. The 8th of December. Today I told Patrick that I wanted him to stay home while I went to a seminar, that we could go on a cruise during spring break. We had talked about a cruise in the past, so the idea wasn't a new one. He wasn't too happy about it, but eventually agreed to stay home. I feel so guilty for lying to him about this trip. I haven't decided to take Anthony with me yet, but I probably want to keep that option open. Since then, I've thought back to our little affair on the couch in my office many times. I can't understand why I think about it. I am so happy with Patrick and our life together. I've never thought of Anthony any other way than as just a partner. There's definitely no love here. It would be nice to spend some unhurried time with him, as he is definitely an experienced lover. I wonder if he'll call me or give up the idea. The 12th of December. Anthony called me at the office this morning. He still wants me to take him to Columbus with me. He suggested that I call them and book 2 adjoining rooms so no one would see us go into the same room. His idea of me calling him my brother and booking a room in his name sounds foolproof. He said he'll call me again tomorrow to see if I've done everything, and if so, he'll call them to put the room on his credit card. Now I have to decide if I'm going to consciously plan to cheat on Patrick. The 14th of December. Anthony called again today. Apparently he tried to call me yesterday, but I wasn't in the office. I did call and made the appointment he suggested. I felt so bad doing it. We were given numbers 412 and 414. He is going to call today and put number 414 on his visa. He seems excited about it. I can't say I'm really excited, but I think I'm looking forward to it. Anthony will be leaving at the end of the spring semester, and he is no longer in the TA program. I hope I won't be tempted to meet him again after our 3 nights at the Sheraton. I don't know what it is about Anthony that turns me on so much. There have been plenty of handsome men in the past who have looked at me, but I've never been tempted. I think he's the kind of guy who naturally knows how to push all the right buttons. At least I think he is. God, I hope Patrick never finds out about this. It would kill him. He doesn't deserve that at all. There were several entries in the rest of December, but only one of them mentioned Anthony or the plan he and Glenda had made to spend 3 nights at the Sheraton. Apparently, he called her home 2 days after Christmas. The 28th of December. Yesterday, Anthony called me at home. I was shocked to hear his voice, but at the same time grateful that Patrick had to work. Anthony said he was prepared for a man to pick up the phone, and in case he did, he would ask for a girl named Veronica. He said he just wanted to make sure I would still agree to it, since he would have to fly back for New Year's Eve if he was going to go with me. I told him I was going to take him with me, and he was very excited. I tried to talk about it calmly, but deep down I had to admit I was excited too. I really expected this to help me get rid of him. Before Patrick and I had gotten married, I had never spent even 2 nights in a row with the same man. I thought about it, and maybe that's why I decided to go along with Anthony's suggestion that we spend that time together. I just pray it throws me off balance. Patrick looked at his watch and saw that it was almost 5 in the morning. He knew that the next entry was the one he read first, right after he opened the diary. He had almost finished the last book of Glenda's diaries, but he had already decided he had to read them all. Even though from what he had read, it was clear that she had never cheated on him, he needed to know for sure. He wanted to know if there was anyone else he could take his anger out on. He already knew he had a lot to do today, so without finishing the last page, he went back to the kitchen to make coffee. There would be time to sleep later. With a cup of fresh coffee in hand, he returned to the living room to reread the last page of the book. The 3rd of January. Well, tomorrow is a big day. I'm leaving for 3 days of seminars and 3 nights with Anthony. I'll pick him up before I leave town, and I'll probably drop him off at his house on the way back. Thank goodness Patrick didn't seriously try to talk me into taking him with me on this trip. I don't know what I would have said to him if he had. Patrick got me a map from the internet so I wouldn't get lost when I drove there. This afternoon, while he was at work, I looked online and found that there is a Victoria's Secret store in the mall next to the Sheraton. I think I'll buy a couple outfits to wear with Anthony, and I can always rinse them out before coming back to wear them for Patrick. I don't really like the thought of doing that, but he'll never know. I forgot to tell Anthony that he better have a good supply of condoms, since I'm not going to risk bringing home a surprise for Patrick. If he doesn't have condoms with him, we can always stop by the drugstore. There's probably one at the mall with the lingerie store. I think we'll stop there before we check in. I can't believe I'm so excited about this trip. I'm also wondering if Anthony will expect me to do things that Patrick and I have never tried. I'm not sure I'd like that because it would be hard to offer Patrick something new right from the doorstep. He might wonder where I got the idea. Maybe if that happens, I'll save what I learned for our cruise because you can always say I'm just adventurous. I've already started packing and I hope Patrick doesn't find it suspicious. The last thing I want is for him to suspect anything. I just read all my thoughts for the day and wondered if I could really go through with it. What happened in my office was very spontaneous. If Anthony and I are going to spend even 1 night together on this trip, it will have been planned in advance. There's no way I can justify it, even to myself, as a momentary weakness. I guess I could still tell Anthony that I refuse and pay for his room and travel expenses. That's probably not a problem now, though. I'm already getting wet just thinking about it. Patrick finished his 7th journal and sat sipping his coffee, going over in his mind all the details he had read in the previous 9 hours. Sitting down, he began to formulate a plan that he could work on for the next 3 days. He had already made up his mind that he was done with his marriage. Even if she reneged on her agreement with Anthony, he would never be able to trust her again. Even the thought of forgiving her seemed hopeless. Hours passed, and he could feel his love for Glenda fading away, while at the same time his hatred for Anthony grew exponentially. Shortly before noon, Patrick got up from his computer and went to get a cordless phone. Taking it out, he sat down at the computer again and dialed the number on the screen. Pearsall Investigations. How can I help you? The woman who answered the phone spoke in a very businesslike manner, and Patrick noticed it immediately. Do you handle divorces? Patrick wasn't sure what to call the work he wanted to do, but assumed it usually involved divorces. If you mean do we get pictures of cheating spouses and things like that, the answer is yes. Would you like to talk to the investigator? The woman's professional manner gave her away, and Patrick now felt comfortable. Yes, I'd like to talk to someone. It's the kind of work I'd like to do. The phone switched to a soft rock station, and Patrick waited nearly 30 seconds before the investigator answered the call. This is John Pearsall speaking. I understand you're looking for divorce evidence. How can I help you? The man's voice was very businesslike, and Patrick immediately set about telling him his story. I believe my wife is having an affair with a man at the Sheraton Hotel near the airport. I was wondering if you would be able to provide me with photographic evidence and how much it would cost. Patrick wasn't sure exactly what he needed to know or how exactly he could convey his request. The Sheraton, you say? We can definitely handle that. Is this happening now? What kind of timeline are we talking about? Patrick made himself comfortable and said, My wife is there now. She's staying until Saturday morning. She's staying in room 412, and the man she's seeing is in 414. They're adjoining rooms. They were there last night as well, but I didn't decide what I was going to do until this morning. My wife is attending a series of seminars, and the guy she's dating came with her. He wondered if the investigator would understand this unintended double meaning. John Pearsall must have caught the joke, for he chuckled before saying, I need a few more details, and I'd like to know what kind of surveillance you want. First, could you give me their names and descriptions? Patrick described his wife and offered to email a picture if necessary. He had found the firm through the website, but didn't want to waste time emailing. He also gave Anthony's full name and gave him a vague description from his wife's diary. It's pretty simple, Mr. Dunn. We can install cameras in their rooms this afternoon and leave them there until the weekend after they check out. It will only take a few minutes to install the equipment, and I just checked my data on the Sheraton. We have an acquaintance who will let us into the rooms for a flat rate per entry. Unless you are going to require us to keep an eye on them, there is no hourly charge for our services. I think a flat fee of $800 will suit you if you only want photographic evidence. You said cameras. Wouldn't it be a lot cheaper to use just one? I only need confirmation that they were together. In fact, I'd like to check them out just tonight. If there are pictures that prove they spent the night together, I'd like to have them by late tomorrow evening. Patrick hadn't thought about the details and what it would take and didn't know what to ask. We don't know which room they will use, so we will have to install cameras in both. The cost is reasonable considering the high-quality equipment we use and the expense we incur. If we pay a maintenance man to let us into those two rooms twice, once to install the equipment and once to remove it, it will cost us $100. I'm sorry, I didn't think. I've never had to do this before. I assume you want an upfront payment. I'll make the payment by credit card on your website, if that's okay with you. Patrick was determined to set things up. The man he was dealing with sounded like a professional, and he didn't feel like going all the way out of his way to meet him in person. With the help of the website, everything will be fine. When you fill out the form, include the case number 1372A. That will help our accountants not get confused. As soon as I receive your payment, I'll head out to install the cameras. We'll create a DVD of the footage from the cameras. I'll need your name and address to forward them. It seemed simple to Patrick, but having the DVD mailed to him wouldn't do much good. Could you keep the DVD in your possession until I contact you? Right now I need pictures to prove that they're really out there dating. I don't need anything explicit, just pictures that make it clear they are having an affair. You can email them to me tomorrow and I'll print them out here. You're the boss, Mr. Dunn. I can easily take pictures from the video stream. The DVD can stay in your file until you request it. Patrick provided his phone number and made a credit card payment while they were still talking to each other. After confirming the payment, the investigator promised to start installing the cameras right away. Satisfied with his arrangement with the private investigator, Patrick finally succumbed to sleep deprivation. He stretched out on the couch and soon fell asleep. By late afternoon, he woke up somewhat refreshed, but definitely hungry. After eating a warmed-up pizza, he returned to his chair, opened the first of the 6 completed diaries, and began to read. Things went much faster now because he didn't reread anything and didn't spend much time thinking about the content. He had just finished the first volume and stood up to stretch his legs when he received a phone call from Glenda just before 10 o'clock in the evening. He felt surprisingly comfortable talking to her. Neither of them had hinted to each other that they had secrets. As he hung up, he wondered if it was as easy for her to hide her intentions as it was for him. Now that he had his plans worked out, it was simple for him to do whatever was necessary. As he pondered this, he wondered if he would ever feel like a normal person again. Before he started the second volume, he checked his plans one more time. He had more details to take care of on Friday, specifically visiting his bank and arranging finances. He had already called Anderson Electric and quit his job, and the last check was due sometime the next day. It was past 1 o'clock in the morning when he finally finished the second volume. It took him much longer to read the second book than the first, because he realized that it was quite possible, even likely, that while he was sitting there reading, Glenda was in bed with Anthony at the Sheraton Hotel. His thoughts turned now and then from the written pages to the exciting erotic scenes generated by his imagination. By this time, Patrick was very tired and decided to sleep a few more hours if he could. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep in the bed he and Glenda always shared, so he stretched out on the couch again. Surprisingly, he managed to doze off and eventually woke up at 7 in the morning, feeling rested. After a quick breakfast, he resumed reading, starting at the beginning of the third volume. By noon, he had finished the third and fourth volumes and was able to put the diaries aside to complete all the to-dos on his list. The first thing he did was stop by Anderson Electric to pick up his last check and clear out his locker. The owner of the company, Gus Anderson, was trying to convince him to change his mind as he hated to lose his best employee. When Patrick explained a little about his situation, Gus realized that his pleas were going nowhere and reluctantly shook Patrick's hand, wishing him the best. He managed to get Patrick to promise to return to Anderson Electric in the future if possible. The trip to the bank took a little longer as he had a lot more paperwork to do. When he was finally able to leave, the cloth bag contained more than $20,000, the entire amount he had been able to withdraw from joint and personal accounts. He had hoped for more, but additional funds would require Glenda's signature. The money he was able to withdraw was just to meet his immediate needs. It was almost 4 o'clock when he got home, and the first thing he did was check his answering machine. There was a message from Pearsall Investigations, and pulling himself together, he dialed the direct line number to John Pearsall. "This is John Pearsall. How can I help you?" "This is Patrick Dunn taking your call. Were you able to set up the cameras and have you gotten any results?" "Ah, yes, Mr. Dunn. We were able to set up cameras in both rooms yesterday afternoon, and I received the results just after noon today. Both rooms were vacant when we were there, so it was a very quick in-and-out operation." Patrick hesitated for a moment before asking, Was there anything special on the tapes?" He was almost holding his breath, waiting for John Pearsall's answer. "Well, Patrick, this isn't easy for me to say, but your suspicions have been confirmed. I'm sure we'll have all the evidence you'll need to file for divorce." The two of them spent the night in your wife's room and had sexual relations on several occasions. "I have transferred the video files to DVD, and you will have them whenever you want them. You mentioned that you would like 3 frames from the videotape, and I am willing to email them to you if you still want them." Those words from John brought tears to Patrick's eyes, much to his own surprise. Despite everything he had read, knowing that he had visual confirmation somehow took the whole situation from possible fiction to actual fact. "Yes, please send me the pictures." "Thank you very much, Mr. Pearsall. If everything is fully paid for, I believe our business is complete." "Yes, your payment has covered the bill in full." "Are you sure you are all right? Your voice sounds a little different than it did yesterday. I know situations like this often lead to a lot of emotional pain, and frankly, I'm a little concerned." Patrick regained control of his emotions, but you could definitely hear a note of concern in his voice when he said, "I'm fine, thank you. I'll be sure to let you know if I need anything else. I'm sure your attorney will want a copy of that DVD, unless you decide to file for divorce on grounds other than adultery. In any case, we'll keep it for a year or until we get your instructions. You know, many of my clients have told me that psychotherapy can help in situations like this. It's not my expertise, but I realize that an affirmation like the DVD I have here often makes a big difference to the injured party, and that a good therapist can help you through it all. Please don't worry, Mr. Pearsall. I know what I need to do to overcome this. Thank you for your professional help." Patrick hung up before John Pearsall could say anything else. His face had turned into a mask hiding his emotions, whatever they were. He was still sitting at the kitchen table when he heard the computer beep that a letter had arrived. He quietly made his way to the room where the computer stood and opened the letter from Pearsall Investigations. After looking at each of the 3 photos attached to the letter, he sent them to the printer, which had 8 by 10 photo paper tucked into it. Within minutes, he held in his hands the paper evidence of his wife's infidelity. As required, none of the photos contained explicit acts. One of the photos showed the two of them lying together under a sheet pulled up to their waists. This photo bothered Patrick the most. The frame captured in it was enough to get Patrick past the point of no return as far as his emotions were concerned. Taking one last careful look at each of the photos, Patrick placed all 3 in the brown envelope that was waiting there for him. Leaving the envelope on the kitchen table, he returned to the chair he had spent most of the last 2 days in and picked up the 5th diary. Shortly before midnight, Patrick finished the last 2 volumes of Glenda's diaries. As he sat and pondered all 6 volumes, he realized how much Glenda had always conformed to his ideas of her. There were very few surprises within the pages of these 6 books. Nowhere had he read anything that might have led him to think of betrayal. But he had learned many little secrets about her that helped him make sense of situations in their past. He realized that she was more insecure than he had realized, as many of her journal entries testified to how much she lacked self-confidence. But one thing that was still striking was her obvious deep love for him. This made it even harder for Patrick to understand her actions with Anthony. The only surprise he discovered was that their meeting at a birthday party years ago had not been a coincidence. He learned that when someone had mentioned in passing that the guest of honor knew Patrick, Glenda had been excited about the possibility of meeting him again. It was at her request that he had been invited to the party, and the rest was history. Reading the 2 volumes occupied him so much that it was only after finishing them that he realized Glenda had not called, and that he was very hungry. While he made himself a sandwich and a soft drink, his thoughts were occupied with Glenda and Anthony replaying their parts from the night before. The thoughts kept him from relaxing and reinforced his commitment to the decision he had already made. Whether it was because of the dinner he ate before stretching out on the couch or the 8x10 pictures of Glenda and Anthony that appeared in his mind every time he closed his eyes, he slept very restlessly that night. It wasn't until 7 in the morning that he gave up trying to rest and got up to start the day he had been preparing for the previous 2 days. He had a lot of things to do, so he decided to get an early start. At 8:30 a.m., he called his only surviving close relative, his brother Samuel. It wasn't that they were estranged, but they rarely saw each other, aside from the obligatory Christmas visits. It had only been 2 weeks since his brother, sister-in-law Mary, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Sam and 10-year-old Brenda, had visited. It was obvious to Patrick that his brother was surprised to learn that Patrick intended to stop by that morning for a short visit. Fortunately, Samuel and his family had no other plans. Patrick managed to keep himself busy until he arrived at his brother's house a little after 10 a.m. Knowing that the 2 children were anxious to get back to their chores, Patrick called them into the kitchen where he sat down with his brother at the table, while Mary made fresh coffee. He knew from their Christmas visit that the family planned to visit Disneyland during spring break, so he gave each of the children a crisp new $100 bill to spend. They were thrilled with the gift, thanking and hugging each other generously. "You didn't have to do that, Patrick," Samuel said, "but it was very nice of you to make them so happy. How are you doing? Did you win the Powerball lottery?" Patrick smiled weakly and replied, "No, nothing like that. My luck is certainly nothing to brag about. I just felt generous." The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table with coffee and made small talk. Finally, Mary said, "I guess I don't need to dodge talking about the big plans you and Glenda have. She told me about how the 2 of you are going to start a family. I know you'll enjoy having children around, just as much as we will." Patrick was quiet for a few moments before replying, "She told you that, didn't she? I guess there aren't many things women don't talk to each other about." Before Mary could finish her sentence, Patrick continued, "It's hard to say how our plans will pan out. A lot of things can interfere with decisions like this." He effectively changed the subject by turning to his brother and asking him a couple questions about his work as a restaurant manager. A few minutes after the coffee cups were finished, Patrick got up to leave. "Just in case I don't see you again until next Christmas, I hope you're doing well." He shook his brother's hand quickly, then turned and gave Mary a brief hug. "I'll be thinking of you." With that short remark, he turned and walked away, and the three of them said their goodbyes as he walked to his car. As Patrick drove away, Samuel turned to Mary. "I wonder what that was about." He seemed to be thinking about something, but he didn't seem like he wanted to talk about it. Mary didn't seem to think anything unusual was going on and replied, "Patrick is probably just trying to kill time until Glenda gets back from the course she signed up for. I remember her saying she'd be gone until tonight." The two of them, hand in hand, walked back to the house, discussing plans for the rest of the day. Shortly before 6 o'clock in the evening, Glenda Dunn drove up to her house. She was a little surprised to see that Patrick's car was not there and quickly entered the house through the side door to the kitchen. She had rehearsed her first meeting with her husband since coming home and was a little flustered that he wasn't home and only silently answered her call when she entered the kitchen. That she had returned to an empty house was not a surprise to her. In a way, she knew it was a good thing, as it would allow her to unpack and throw the clothes from her suitcase into the washing machine. She was about to take another shower, unsure if the morning shower had completely washed away the last traces of Anthony. As she walked past the kitchen table, she noticed a piece of paper pinned to the center of the table by a salt shaker. Realizing it must be from Patrick, she picked it up. "Glenda, Gus called me from his office this morning. He needs an anchor for an urgent job in Centerville, and I've agreed to keep an eye on him. Overtime will be good. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon. Patrick." Glenda was slightly unhappy with the note, though it allowed her to accomplish everything she wanted to do before her first meeting with her husband after the trip. She put the note on the kitchen table and took her bag upstairs to take everything to the washing machine. As she walked up the stairs, she had already decided that she was going to take a nice, long, hot bath instead of a shower. She transferred the things that needed washing to the laundry basket and was already carrying it to the bedroom door when she noticed her journal on the tall dresser. She immediately remembered that she had left it in her emergency bag on Wednesday and picked it up to carry it downstairs. She was relieved to see that the diary was where she had left it and that it was undisturbed. She had intended to update it during the trip, but had been unable to do so after discovering that she had forgotten it. She realized where it was when Patrick told her where the emergency bag was, and she distinctly remembered putting 2 items in there. Patrick had obviously put the bag back on the shelf and left the journal where it was. She decided to update it while she did the laundry, since it was a little early to relax in the tub. While the washing machine removed the last traces of Anthony from her clothes, Glenda made herself a sandwich and a bowl of soup. When she finished her meal, she put the dirty dishes away in the sink and walked over to the phone where she pressed the preset button to call Patrick's cell phone. It rang twice before she realized the ringing sound was coming from the wicker basket on the kitchen table. In the basket, they both kept their keys, cell phones, and sometimes their wallet or change. Hanging up the phone, she walked over to the counter and took Patrick's cell phone from the basket. "Damn! How am I supposed to reach you now?" It was a purely rhetorical question, and after asking it, she walked back to the kitchen table and placed the day planner in front of her. The small brass key that could be used to open the diary was in her wallet, attached to a piece of red yarn, and she quickly used it to undo the lock. Having removed the lock, she opened the book to the first blank page, took a pen, and began to write. The 7th of January. The most eventful 4 days of my life have just ended, and I hope I can remember everything I wanted to tell you. Some things may not be pleasant to put on paper, but I have to do it. When I picked Anthony up from his house, it was obvious that he was looking forward to it. As we drove, he kept trying to touch me, and I resented him a little for it. Eventually, he left me alone until we got on the highway, after I warned him that someone I knew might see us. The farther we got away from the city, the more I relaxed, and when we finally got there, I was already enjoying myself and his attention. We stopped at the mall before heading to the Sheraton, and while he went to the drugstore, I went to the Victoria's Secret store to pick out some lingerie. He must have run all the way there and back because he joined me in the store before I could buy anything. He made several suggestions and I ended up buying 1 set that he liked and 2 that I preferred. I wore it for him Wednesday night and he doesn't know it, but I wrapped it in an empty bag and left it in the trash can when we left the store this morning. There's no way I can wear it for Patrick, especially since Anthony picked it out. I've also decided to throw away the 2 sets of bras I bought since I don't want anything to remind me of my nights at the Sheraton. I know I will never be able to erase all the memories, but I will try. On Wednesday night, Anthony came to my room and it didn't take us long to get to know each other. After that first night, I finally realized there was a huge difference between sex and love. I told Anthony that was the end of it. The novelty I had enjoyed that first night together quickly wore off, and I began to realize how much more I enjoyed making love with my husband. I didn't want to fight with Anthony, so I didn't say anything to him until we started getting ready for bed. He became very angry, and for a while I was even a little scared of him. Since it was getting late, we agreed to stop arguing and we both fell asleep pretty quickly, although I had already started making plans on how I was going to try to make it up to Patrick for all of this. Friday morning, I woke up to find Anthony getting ready to do it with me. I tried to stop him and told him that I meant what I had said the night before. He wouldn't listen to me. When he finished, he went back to his room and I locked the connecting door between our rooms. I spoke to him through the locked door and told him not to plan on coming to my room again. He replied that it was fine and that he would find another partner for Friday night. He told me that I wasn't the only female sociology professor staying at the hotel. Sure enough, after the closing dinner, I saw Anthony with one of the women who had attended several sessions with me. I know she was married, but she was as fascinated by Anthony as I was. You can't imagine the relief I felt when I realized I didn't have to argue with him last night. I heard them enter his room. Last night, lying in my bed, I began to realize that Anthony is a predator, choosing older women he feels he can manipulate. To my eternal shame, I am one of the women he was able to control. I was afraid the ride home with him would be horrible, but it actually went quite well. Now that I saw Anthony for who he was, I was able to maintain control of the conversation and our physical interaction. I think he had enough to satiate himself, as he was behaving quite decently. He didn't argue when I told him I didn't want to see him anymore. I think he realized he couldn't control me anymore. I had a lot of time to think as we drove home, and I've already decided that I'm going to make an appointment with a psychiatrist or psychologist on Monday morning. I need to know that I will never cheat on Patrick again, and to do that, I think I need to understand how I let Anthony take control of me. I have to do something about this obvious flaw in my character. What allowed this shameful episode to happen must be brought under control or eliminated. I would rather die than succumb to that kind of temptation again. I have also decided to spend the rest of my life making amends to Patrick, even if he never learns the reason why. It's enough that I know this terrible secret. I can only pray that he never finds out. There is one more decision I have made. If Patrick agrees, I intend to stop taking the pill when my current prescription expires in 12 days. The prospect of having children has begun to worry me, and there is no point in waiting any longer. When Glenda finished writing her long entry, she used the pen as a bookmark, left the book on the table, and went upstairs to prepare the bath. She took the cordless phone with her into the bathroom in case Patrick called. When the tub was filled to the proper level, she added bath oil, lit the candles, and submerged herself in the water. As she settled into the tub, she finally closed her eyes and let the warm water relax her. She was so comfortable that she was on the verge of sleep when she had the feeling that she was being watched. She slowly opened her eyes and turned her head to peek into the bedroom, but no one was there. She went back to resting comfortably and continued to think about how she could make it up to Patrick for her foolish relationship with Anthony. An hour later, she returned to the kitchen completely refreshed. After putting the laundry in the dryer, she returned to the kitchen table to reread the last entry in her journal. For a moment, she was confused by the fact that the pen was missing from the book. She was sure she had left it between the pages, but soon realized her mistake when she saw it on the kitchen table next to the wicker basket. Taking the pen, she opened the diary and began to read. Sunday morning, Glenda got up refreshed and was excited to start a new phase of her life. After spending the morning cleaning, she showered and changed into an outfit she knew Patrick liked. By mid-afternoon, she was relaxing at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while a large roast was cooking in the oven when she was interrupted by a knock on the side door. She was surprised and alarmed to see two large men standing outside the door. One of them, a young uniformed policeman standing off to the side with his hand on the butt of a holstered pistol. The second man was slightly older, dressed in a suit and coat, and held a police ID in his hand. "I'm Detective Rankin, and this is Officer Reynolds. We're with the Springfield Police Department, and we're looking for Patrick Dunn. Could you tell us if he's home?" Glenda's face reflected relief, and she quickly replied, "Patrick is at work right now. As soon as I saw you, I was afraid something had happened to him. I'm his wife, by the way. Maybe I can help you." The two men exchanged a quick glance, after which the detective said, "Maybe we should go inside." "It's a little chilly in here." Glenda stepped away from the door and said, Sure, come on in. She led both men into the kitchen and continued, Why are you looking for Patrick? A look of concern reappeared on her face. Then she asked, He's not hurt, is he? Detective Rankin quickly replied, No, nothing like that. As far as we know, your husband is in perfect health. We just need to talk to him about a case we're working on. Are you sure your husband is at work? Of course I'm sure. She walked over to the counter and picked up the note Patrick had left for her. She held it out to the detective and then continued. You can read his message for yourself. It was waiting for me when I got home from my trip last night. Officer Reynolds positioned himself at the counter from where he could watch the back entrance as well as the entire kitchen. He continued to keep his hand on the butt of his weapon. Detective Rankin handed him a note, and after reading its contents, the officer handed it back to him. Do you mind if I keep this, Mrs. Dunn? When she shook her head, the detective opened the zippered briefcase and placed the note inside. Glenda's curiosity took over, and she nervously asked, Why do you need to talk to Patrick? What interest could the police possibly have in him? He's never been in any trouble. The detective replied, This morning we received a call from homicide reporting a murder. The call was recorded, and we were able to trace your husband's cell phone from the number it was made from. We are now working with your husband's cell phone carrier to find out where he was at the time of the call. Relief ran across Glenda's face. Well, obviously you made a mistake somewhere. I tried to call my husband last night as soon as I got home, and when I called his cell phone, I found that he had left it at home. It's in that basket over there. She pointed to a wicker basket on the kitchen table. The detective's face was clearly skeptical. Do you mind if I check his cell phone? When he finished speaking, he walked over to the basket, looked at it for a couple moments, then picked it up and returned to the kitchen table with it. I don't see any cell phone here, Mrs. Dunn. Are you sure you're not thinking about some other day than yesterday? Glenda's face reflected shock as she verified that the basket was indeed empty. She quickly walked over to where the basket had been and looked around, even though it was obvious that there was nothing else on the counter. I don't understand. His phone was still there when I tried to call him last night. She shifted her gaze from officer to detective with obvious frustration and concern. Well, I can't explain why the phone wasn't in the basket where you claim it should have been, Mrs. Dunn. Obviously, I have to believe that the call that was traced to your husband's cell phone was actually made from that phone. The detective opened his folder and made a few notes before continuing. Is your husband familiar with Mr. Anthony Romano? Glenda was even more surprised at the mention of that name, and her face lost color for a moment before she replied, I know Anthony Romano, but my husband doesn't know him. Anthony was my assistant last semester. The two men exchanged glances again before the detective said, So your husband had no reason to dislike Mr. Romano? Are you absolutely certain he didn't know him? Glenda began to look panicked as she replied, No, Patrick never met Anthony. The detective took a few more notes before looking up at her and saying, Well, your husband seems to have known Mr. Romano well enough to make the call that reported him murdered. Glenda was so shocked by this statement that she sat down at the table and only then said, Anthony is dead! He was on a trip with me and I just brought him home around 5:30 yesterday afternoon. How can he be dead? Detective Rankin sat down on the opposite end of the table and asked Glenda, What was your relationship with Mr. Romano? Could they have been a reason for your husband's murder? Glenda's face turned white as the detective spoke. After a moment, she came to her senses and said, Anthony was just a high school student, my assistant, and my husband had no reason to do that to him. Although she said these words, the tone of her voice was not convincing. The detective made her sit and fidget for almost half a minute before he said, When we arrived at the address your husband gave us, we found evidence that Mr. Romano was attacked as he walked through his front door. There was a travel bag lying in the middle of the hallway, as well as footprints indicating that a fight had taken place there. Apparently, Mr. Romano lost the fight and was dragged into the kitchen where he was tied to a chair with nylon straps that are commonly used to tie electrical wires together. Glenda began to cry quietly as he described the scene at Anthony's house. Mr. Romano was shot in the left knee before he was dragged into the kitchen, and the medical examiner believes a major artery was hit because a lot of blood was lost. We haven't gotten the autopsy results back yet. It appears that Mr. Romano was struck several times before he was killed by a single gunshot to the head. He continued, preliminary forensics also revealed that he was shot once in the groin, a non-fatal wound that was likely inflicted post-mortem. The estimated time of death is between 6 and 8 o'clock this evening. At this point, Glenda interrupted him, saying, Patrick could never do something like that to anyone. He's not like that. Her crying had almost stopped, and it was obvious that she was angry rather than upset. The detective turned to his notes again before continuing. According to state records, your husband has a permit for a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun. One of the bullets that hit Mr. Romano was recovered from the chair he was tied to, and our technicians have tentatively determined that it was a .25 caliber. There also remains the question of motive. Detective Rankin rummaged through his folder and finally pulled out 3 photocopies, which he placed on the table in front of Glenda. These are photocopies of 3 photographs found at the crime scene. Their placement on the table next to Mr. Romano indicates that he was shown the 3 photos before he died. Blood spatter indicates that they were there when the fatal shot was fired. I don't think you've been completely honest with me about your relationship with Anthony Romano or your husband's interest in him. Glenda took the 3 photocopies in her hands and stared at them in shock as the detective spoke. When it dawned on her exactly what the photos depicted, she began to cry in earnest, saying, No! Patrick couldn't have known! Just as he was about to continue describing the crime scene, the detective received a call on his cell phone. During the 3-minute conversation, he said almost nothing and spent most of the time writing in his notebook. While he was writing, Glenda had become quieter and was now sitting with her hands in front of her face, sobbing. Finishing his notes, the detective looked up at Glenda and said, Your husband's call was made from Windsor, Ontario. The local police in Windsor worked with a cell phone company and found his cell phone. It was in a cloth bag along with credit cards and a .25 caliber handgun that was registered to him. The bag was in a trash can in the Walmart supermarket parking lot. Neither himself nor his car was seen, although license plates from his car were also found in the trash. They believe he may have stolen a license plate from another car in the parking lot to blend into the flow of cars from Ontario. This news did not comfort Glenda, and she continued to cry inconsolably as she sat at her desk. After watching her for a few minutes, the detective pulled another photocopy out of his folder and placed it in front of her. It was a copy of a photograph of a small brass key with a ruler lying next to it. There was a small key in the photos. We have no idea of its significance. Do you recognize it? Glenda looked at the photograph and immediately grabbed her purse. In a matter of seconds, she retrieved the diary key from her wallet and held it next to the photo of his doppelganger. At that moment, she completely lost control of herself and slumped down in her chair. The only words she uttered afterward were, "Diary" and "Patrick." The 2 men stayed with Glenda for almost 15 minutes, waiting for her to calm down. Eventually, they managed to convince her to call someone who could come and be with her. After making sure her sister would arrive within a few minutes, they finally left. As they walked to their cars, Officer Reynolds asked, "Do you think they'll apprehend him quickly?" "It all depends on how well he can hide for the next 2 weeks. He hasn't committed any crimes in Canada, so I don't know how high a priority their police will place on finding him. It's not like he's a serial killer. If he manages to go undetected, the longer he's on the run, the less chance he has of being caught. If he's still at large 6 months from now, we might ask for the case to be publicized on TV. Some of these most wanted shows are getting good results." Officer Reynolds pondered that answer for a few seconds before asking another question. "What did you think of that cell phone story of hers? I thought she was serious when she said the phone was there last night." "Yeah, I agree. I don't think she was lying or confusing her statement. I suspect he came back here, but for some reason never followed through with the plan. While here, he probably saw his cell phone and decided at that point to take it with him." The uniformed officer looked a little puzzled and asked, "Well, if he was here, why wouldn't he let her know? It's kind of inexplicable that he came back and just took the cell phone." Detective Rankin stopped, looked at the young man and said, "Think about it. Patrick Dunn just killed her lover and he's coming home. The only reason to come back that I can think of is to kill her, and maybe myself. I don't know what happened that made him change his mind, but I don't believe for a second that he just went back for his cell phone." Reynolds nodded his head slowly, mulling over the detective's words. Finally, he said, I believe Mrs. Dunn will eventually realize how close she was to losing her life and wonder why she didn't. I wonder how she'll feel about it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.